Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Tyler's Row by Miss Reed. We are following Diana Hale as she gets used to living on Tyler's Row along with her husband. He and she are the landlord and landlady. The week in which Diana Hale waited to go for her hospital tests seemed to be the longest of her life. Not that it was without incident. Mrs. Jones, who had agreed to come once a week just to see how it goes, found that the journey made the day a long one, and having expressed her doubts about being able to continue, particularly during the winter, finally gave her notice during the week of waiting. Both women were genuinely sorry to part. Mrs. Jones had been a faithful servant for many years, a staunch friend to the Hales and their two boys. But she was getting on in years, and Diana could see that she was wise to give up. "I shan't leave until you've found someone else," declared Mrs. Jones, "but I thought you should know the minute I'd made up my mind. There'll be plenty in the village, I don't doubt. It was jump at the job." "Well, I hope so," admitted Diana, "but it will be hard to find someone as reliable as you are." She pondered the matter in bed that night as Peter slept dreamlessly. Should she advertise in the Caxley Chronicle? Or would a postcard put up in Mr. Lamb's post office be better? Or simply let him know that she was looking for domestic help? The night was warm, and the smell of jasmine crept sweetly through the open window. Somewhere across the village an owl hooted in the darkness. There seemed to be rustling sounds, too, in the garden. Tom, perhaps, stalking a poor mouse, or even hedgehogs on the prowl. They could make quite a lot of noise for such small animals. Suddenly, the unearthly howling of a dog split the silence, followed by a sharp yapping, and then the unmistakable shindy of a dogfight just below the window. More barking added to the din. Peter sat up, jerked from slumber. "What the devil's going on?" "I don't know. It's only just started." Before he had time to get out of bed to investigate, there was the sound of a window opening next door. Mrs. Fowler was obviously making her own investigations. "Push off!" screamed the lady, beside herself. "Get off home! Be off with you!" There was the sound of another window opening. Sergeant Burnaby, it seemed, had also been disturbed, despite his deafness. "Stop that hollering!" commanded the sergeant, in a voice that had made itself heard under heavy shell fire in its time. "How do you expect law-abiding Christians to sleep with that racket going on?" "If I had a gun," said Peter grimly to Diana, "I'd train it on our neighbors in turn, so help me. As it is, I suppose I'd better lean out and read the Riot Act." "Not for a minute," begged Diana. "Who knows what he might say in the heat of the moment?" "You mind your own business," yelled Mrs. Fowler, evidently retreating for a moment, but returning to her post bearing something that chinked against the window fastening. The dogfight seemed to be continuing a little further down the garden, but there were whimpering sounds and more barking near at hand, as if a dozen or more dogs were still close to the house. A sloshing noise, followed by wild yelping and what sounded like a stampede of elephants, indicated that Mrs. Fowler had tipped the water from the bedroom ewer over her unwelcome guests. "Let that be a lesson to you," she shouted, slamming shut the window with such force that all four cottages in Tyler's Row shuddered. There was an answering slam from Sergeant Burnaby's window, and then silence from each side of the Hales' abode. Outside, the noise of snuffling, whining, and yelping went on, but with slightly less energy. Mrs. Fowler's activity with the water jug seemed to have had some effect. Certainly, the two main contestants seemed to have retired, probably to carry on their dogfight in some other quarter of the village. "I suppose that damned dog of hers is on heat," said Peter gloomily. "How long does that last?" "About 3 weeks, I believe." "Well, that's jolly. I suppose we'll have all the dogs of the neighborhood growling and prowling round like the hosts of Midian. Do the garden a power of good, that will." He sighed gustily. "I wonder if we've been fools to come here. I must say I never envisioned this sort of persecution when we took on the tenants. What do you think, Di?" He sounded unusually downcast, and Diana rallied herself to speak cheerfully, although she too was full of doubts lately. "It will turn out all right. They're bound to settle down before long. You've told them. It's up to them to have a little sense. I can stand it if you can. We've put all we can spare into this place, and we will jolly well see it gives us pleasure, neighbors or not. That's how I feel. I just can't bear to think I've landed you with this lot. After all, I'm out all day. You're the one who has to put up with it, and you've got enough to worry you just now without these two pests." "Forget it," said Diana comfortingly. "Let's go to sleep." To the faint sound of mingled whimpers and snuffles, the Hales sought slumber. The next morning, a collection of dogs of all shapes and breeds were visible through Mrs. Fowler's hedge, clustered hopefully at her back door. There were plenty of paw marks on the Hales' garden beds, and two of Diana's cherished pestamons were broken down. She was understandably nettled, but tried not to show it before Peter, who was worried enough anyway. He drove off to school, and Diana set about her domestic chores. The morning was punctuated by commotions from Mrs. Fowler's side of the hedge. Every time she opened the back door, she emerged either with a stick or a jug of water to send off the amorous invaders. At the same time, she let fly a stream of invective which quite unnerved Diana. She wondered how soon it would be before Sergeant Burnaby retaliated. She did not have to wait long. A peremptory rapping at the back door came about 10 o'clock. On opening it, Diana faced Sergeant Burnaby, very spruce, his waxed mustache tilted heavenward, and his yellow face unusually stern. "Come in," said Diana with a sinking heart. "Thank you, ma'am. I shan't keep you long. My business won't take more than a minute or two." "Do sit down," invited Diana. "No, thank you, ma'am. I'll say what I have to say standing. I only come because I respect you wanting to have a bit of dignity over Mrs. Fowler's and my upsets. This here bawling as she does in no way to go on." Diana remembered the sergeant's stentorian bellows in the night and found herself speechless. "I'm here to lodge a complaint," went on the old man, "a formal complaint. If your blasted tenant can't keep her blasted bitch under control, I give forewarning I'll take the matter to the police." This was said in Sergeant Burnaby's most polite tones, and Diana was hard put to it not to show her amusement. "Sergeant Burnaby," she said in the cooing voice which had melted many men's hearts, "you're making yourself so unhappy, and us too, you know, by taking offense at every little thing which goes wrong. Of course it's annoying to have all these dogs about, and I intend to visit Mrs. Fowler to see what can be done about it. We can't have our sleep broken as we did last night, but please, Sergeant, try to be a little more forbearing. We've simply got to shake down together peaceably. You must see that." Diana thought she detected a little shame in the old soldier's countenance, but his answer was as belligerent as ever. "I've done my best, ma'am, as you know. That woman's more than flesh and blood can stand, and that damned dog of hers has caused my garden to be turned into a fair wilderness with all them others rooting around. I mean it when I say I'll see the police." Diana put a hand on his arm pleadingly. "Now, don't do anything hasty. I shall see Mrs. Fowler myself. We all want an end to this unpleasantness." The old man stumped toward the door, his back as straight as a ramrod, his mustache bristling. "Well, I've made my complaint. I can't do more, but she'd better watch out." Diana abandoned her soft womanliness and assumed a sterner tone. "Sergeant Burnaby, you must do your part with a little give and take. As my husband has told you, if you can't settle happily at Tyler's Row, it may be best for you to find somewhere else to live." If Diana expected a change of attitude, she was to be disappointed. The old man said nothing, but gave her a glance so full of venom that she felt shocked. The door slammed behind him. It was plain that Sergeant Burnaby was unrepentant. Later that day, she called upon Mrs. Fowler with much the same result. It had needed considerable courage to visit her neighbor, but Diana felt that it must be done. 8 dogs waited hopefully in the garden and watched Diana as she approached. "Better come in, I suppose," said Mrs. Fowler sourly, eyeing the expectant crowd. "It's about them, no doubt." She shut the door behind her visitor and motioned Diana to the battered sofa. "Yes, it is, I'm afraid," said Diana, "not only on our behalf, but on Sergeant Burnaby's as well." Mrs. Fowler gave a contemptuous laugh. "Should have thought he could have done his own dirty work." Diana decided to ignore this and pressed on. "It's very difficult when you have a bitch, I know," she began. "I won't have that word mentioned in my house," said Mrs. Fowler loftily. She folded her arms across her pink cardigan and glared at poor Diana. "I always say lady dog. It's politer." "Just as you wish," agreed Diana hastily. She was devoutly thankful that Peter was not present, or she might have broken down. "I just wondered if you knew that there is something available for lady dogs, which can be put on them when they're in heat. It keeps the dogs away, and is so simple." Diana's innocent suggestion brought a blush to Mrs. Fowler's withered cheek, but whether it was caused by outraged modesty or plain temper, it was difficult to say. "I know the stuff. My niece brought me a tin last night." She turned around to root among a number of medicinal bottles and aerosol tins on the dresser, and held up a large yellow canister proudly. Bright red letters across it said, "Come not nigh." "Haven't had time to use it yet," went on Mrs. Fowler, "and I don't know that I intend to. Nature knows best, my mother always said." Diana, who had now recovered from the shock of the name, decided that a firmer line was needed. "I should certainly use it immediately, or I fear Sergeant Burnaby will be sending for the police. My husband and I are sympathetic to your difficulties, but they can be overcome, and you really can't want to upset your neighbors like this. If you don't want to use this stuff, then why not put the dog into kennels? It's often done." Mrs. Fowler bridled. "And who's going to pay for that, may I ask?" "The dog is your responsibility," replied Diana steadily. She got up from the little ease of a sofa and made her way to the door. Mrs. Fowler looked thoughtful. "I might have a word with my niece when she brings the children to tea," she said in a less belligerent tone of voice. "Do," replied Diana. "And please remember that we all want to sleep at nights, all of us in Tyler's Row." Luckily, Diana's words bore fruit. She saw the niece depart after tea next door, complete with children and the dog. "Come not nigh" must have been applied with a heavy hand, for no dogs followed the little group toward the bus stop, and Tyler's Row was destined to have peaceful nights for over a fortnight. Diana saw the family waiting for the bus when she went to the post office with her carefully written postcard asking for domestic help. On 1 or 2 mornings a week, times and wages to be arranged. "I'll put this up first thing tomorrow," promised John Lamb. "I'm sure you'll be suited without much bother." He watched Diana depart and put the card carefully on one side. He must look out for Bob Willett. This was just the job for his missus, he knew. There was not much that John Lamb did not know in Fairacre. By 8:30 the next morning, Mr. Willett knew about the post as he returned from his early duties at the village school. After a brief word with Mrs. Willett, he collected the bird table and made his way to Tyler's Row. Diana was dusting, but went out into the morning sunshine to admire the bird table. "It's really splendid," she cried. "Do you want to put it up now?" "Better wait till Mr. Hale's here," advised Mr. Willett. "I'll call back this evening if it's convenient. I'll be going up to choir practice, and I should be back here by 8 or so. Mr. Ennett's written a descant to 'Pleasant are thy courts above.' We're doing it Sunday." "How clever of him," commented Diana. "Well, that's as may be. It's my belief he's tone deaf when it comes to making up tunes. This here fairly pierces your eardrums. Atonal, he calls it. That's one way of describing it, I suppose." Modern music does take some getting used to, agreed Diana diplomatically. I was having a word with John Lamb, said Mr. Willett. He tells me as you need a bit of help here. I was wondering if Mrs. Willett might come and see you. She's looking for a light job and you wouldn't get nobody better, and that's the truth. Diana gasped with pleasure. She had met Mrs. Willett at the Women's Institute and frequently in the lanes of Fairacre. This seemed heaven sent. This is good news. Would Mrs. Willett like to call here soon and have a look at the work? At the moment I am paying Mrs. Jones 25 an hour. She might like to know. 25, said Mr. Willett, puzzled. New pence. Ah, Mr. Willett's brow cleared. 5 bob. This decimation gets you down, don't it? By the time I've decimated shillings and pence, I don't know if I'm on my head or my heels. Do you have trouble decimating, Mrs. Hale? It's getting easier. It's pints into liters and ounces into grams I'm dreading. Well now, what about Mrs. Willett coming next Tuesday to see the job? Fine, said Diana, then checked suddenly. No, sorry, I have to go to the hospital that day. She regretted the disclosure the minute she had made it. Mr. Willett's face crumpled with concern. She hoped he would not mention the matter to others. However, nothing could be done. Nothing serious, she said lightly, just a routine check. Good, good, said Mr. Willett, looking relieved. Then perhaps Monday would be better? Ideal. Would 2 o'clock be a good time? Do fine. We've washed up and had a bit of a ziz by them. 40 winks after a bit of dinner is a very good thing, Mrs. Hale. He put the bird table on the porch and surveyed it with his head on one side. Looks a treat, don't it? He said disarmingly. I enjoyed making that. We'll enjoy using it, Diana told him with conviction. Part 3. Settled with some sunshine. 14. Amy's invitation. The fact that Diana Hale had to go to hospital was soon general knowledge in Fairacre. To give Mr. Willett his due, he mentioned this interesting item of news to his wife alone. Whether she inadvertently let the cat out of the bag, or whether Sergeant Burnaby or Mrs. Fowler overheard the conversation in the garden, or whether, as is quite likely, that mysterious communication system, the village grapevine, which works with a life of its own, was to blame, no one can tell. But the village knew quite well that on Tuesday next, Mrs. Hale was going to hospital. Why and which one were matters of debate. Some said the appointment was at Caxley Cottage, others up the county, and those who guessed aright plumped for Oxford. These last admitted that there were so many hospitals in Oxford that it was anyone's guess which it would be. By the law of elimination, they canceled out that bone place, orthopedic, and that loony place, nervous diseases, on the grounds of Diana's physical activity and her obvious mental composure. Further than that, they were unable to go, to their infinite regret. The reason for the visit engaged the villagers' interest pleasurably. Heart trouble and hernias, goiter and gallstones, diabetes and deafness were all discussed with lively conjecture and gruesome accounts of relative sufferings when similarly afflicted. Even the school children discussed the subject seriously and with sympathy. I overheard 2 of them as they squatted on their haunches by a sunny wall, waiting to come into school. What's up, you reckon, with that new lady up Tyler's? Nothing much, having a baby, I expect. Get away, she's too old. She must be 60 or 70. Mum says you can't have a baby after 40. That's where she's wrong then. Our mum had Linda when she was 43, so there. There was silence for a moment before Mrs. Hale's case was resumed. Don't expect it's an operation, more like getting old. Bits of you wear out, like an old bike does. She ain't all that old, not much more than Miss Reed. Well, she's no chicken. I bet she's got bits of her wearing out pretty fast. Too true, I thought, tottering into the playground to call them in. I felt decrepit for the rest of the day. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Pringle told me with evident disappointment that Mrs. Hale had been seen busy weeding the borders on Tuesday evening. Can't be much amiss there, grumbled the lady. Then her eyes brightened. Unless the doctors have missed something, she continued. Some of these young fellows, no more than bits of boys, simply give you a quick prod here and there and look at your tongue, and that's it. Easy enough to miss the vital symptoms. I'm very sorry indeed for Mrs. Hale, I began severely, about to embark on a short pithy lecture on the theme of prying into the affairs of others, but Mrs. Pringle forestalled me as successfully as ever. Oh, so do I, so do I. There's not one in the village as doesn't feel the same. Mrs. Fowler reckons it's liver. Sergeant Burnaby reckons it's a judgment, whatever that may mean. And John Lamb says he's never been one to talk about women's ills and then shut up like a clam. Sensible man, I said. I wonder what that poor soul's doing at this very minute, pondered Mrs. Pringle lugubriously. Minding her own business, perhaps, I retorted sharply. And for once, I had the last word. We will go on to the next word next time.